Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about close observation. Today on the show, I am joined by the artist and writer Jenny Odell. Jenny is the author of a really great new book called How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, as well as one of my truly absolute favorite pieces of design writing of the last few years, this really fascinating essay called There's No Such Thing as a Free Watch. As a visual artist, she was the artist in residence at Recology SF, also sometimes known as The Dump, and the San Francisco Planning Department, and her work's been exhibited all around the world. She also teaches design at Stanford. Jenny originally studied literature in undergrad, but then went on to get an MFA in design, and this is where we start the conversation. I was really interested in talking to her about this early interest in both text and image, and the relationship she sees between them and how they both are a big part of her practice. We also talk about the book, How to Do Nothing, and her writing process. The book is a really interesting book that I admit is kind of hard to describe, and I was really curious about how she thought about it and wanted for it, and how she describes it and what she thinks the book is about. And of course, we talk about teaching. We talk about the classes she teaches, how she kind of teaches art to sometimes non-art students, and how she encourages her students to experiment and fail and try new things. Like I said, I've been a big fan of Jenny's for a while. I've assigned her essay, There's No Such Thing as a Free Watch, in many of my classes, and How to Do Nothing is just another favorite read of this year. So it was a real pleasure to have her on the show to talk about both her approach and her work. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, remember that you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links, and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism, and previews the upcoming episodes. This podcast is fully supported through these memberships, so if you would like to help with the ongoing production of Scratching the Surface, I hope that you consider joining. Thank you, as always, for listening, and enjoy my conversation with Jenny Odell. One of the kind of profiles of you that I read, it mentioned that you studied undergrad, you studied English at Berkeley, and then after that were interested in applying to graphic design MFAs. And that was a part of your history that I did not know until I was preparing for this. And it got me excited and helped explain a lot of the career that you've had. And so I kind of want to start by going back to that moment. What was it about graphic design that you were interested in coming out of an English degree? What was your relationship to graphic design? Why did you think that's kind of where you wanted to go?
To be totally honest, I don't think it was super well thought out. It was this kind of, basically I was an English major, and I was like a very, English English major. Like my thesis was on Emily Dickinson. But I had also been taking art classes, I don't even have an art minor. I just was taking them on the side, and I had made art, since I could remember. And I think, it's clear to me now that they come from the same part of my brain, but like when you're in a school and things are in different departments, like it can be sort of confusing.
Right.
And so I think I thought that graphic design would be this way that I could have both. Because it's a form, it's so much bound up with communication, but it's also visual.
Mm-hmm.
And I had taken some really amazing poetry classes. And I think there is like an overlap. I actually think I wrote this in my application to MFA programs to sort of explain why an English major is applying to this program where, like poetry, it has a lot in common with graphic design. Because it has to do with like where the words are and the ordering and the context and all that. And then, of course, I didn't actually end up doing graphic design. I have an MFA in design, but it's definitely not graphic design. So yeah.
So what is it? Because I in that profile where you mentioned that it was at the San Francisco Art Institute, and it was called Design Technology or something like that.
Yeah, it's now called Art and Technology, but at the time it was called Design and Technology.
What was that? What does that even mean?
It's honestly a good question. That school is very interdisciplinary. And so, I had friends who were like technically painting MFAs who were making like sculptures and, people in new genres making film. And, it's just, once you got in, it was kind of like, it's almost like a department in name only. I mean, that's more true for some than others.
Yeah.
And also the design and technology department was comparatively small. So I don't think it had, and it was newer. So it didn't have as much of an identity as, say, like the photography department has a really long legacy at SFAI. So it was, it's good and bad. I felt like I was on my own in a lot of ways, which I think prevented me from maybe like doing what I thought I was supposed to be doing, because there was no supposed to. But it was also, I definitely felt like the first semester I had been like thrown into an ocean and just like waiting or just like, treading water, until I figured out what I was doing. So
I feel like that's what that first semester of grad school was supposed to be like that, no matter what, though.
That makes me feel better because I really like, it was really, I would like I tell my students about this all the time now to kind of like as to encourage them, where, I tell them like, I showed up and every time I would start making something, I would either get halfway done and decide that it was just a stupid idea, or I would never even start making it in the first place. And I had this bag, or maybe it was a cardboard box in the corner of my studio that had like just random materials in it. I remember it literally had like a spring coming out of it. Like it looked like something from a cartoon, and it just said first semester bag of shame. Like that's what I just did, like, because in case anyone was wondering what that was.
Yeah.
And so I didn't produce
amazing.
like anything the entire first semester.
Did you, I mean, you said you felt like you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing, or that, you didn't have that guidance. Were you still thinking, even though it wasn't a graphic design program, and I promise this whole conversation won't be about your, 22-year-old ambition to be a graphic designer or whatever. Did you still have that mindset that you were supposed to be doing what you thought graphic design was, or what was your feeling there? Were you interested in this confusion? What was that like for you?
I think I was just kind of like just too busy being confused to, I don't know. I mean, because I actually did at that point, I had an idea of what graphic design would like typically be, because let's see, it was like the summer between my junior and senior year in undergrad. I did a graphic design like summer program at Parsons.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And that was pretty like, I remember it as being pretty straightforward. Like the morning was all analog stuff. And then, that's actually an interesting distinction now. The morning was analog and the afternoon was digital.
That is interesting.
And I remember that the instructor of the digital part was the person who had made the Brokeback Mountain poster. That's all I remember.
Okay, I don't know who that is.
I don't remember her name, but I remember being really impressed by that.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it's funny because when I applied to these MFA programs, not realizing that they weren't straightforward graphic design, I had no portfolio other than what I had made during that summer program. And so I just made up these assignments for myself, like based on what had been in those classes. And I bought a 30-day trial of Photoshop and Illustrator.
Nice.
And I just tried to make the rest of my portfolio that way.
And this is the portfolio that you use to like get into the programs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. I love that.
So, that's really funny to look at now. But I do think that, when I look at the stuff that I eventually did end up making in grad school, it is very much, you can, it's still about design. Like there's, I made those pieces where I cut out things from, like 125 swimming pools from Google Earth and arranged them, or I took a virtual road trip across the US via Street View, and that's a book, that has to arrange all of this information, like quotes from people's TripAdvisor reviews and screenshots. And so I think the one thing that didn't change from the beginning was just like this idea of arrangement and like the importance of context.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why I kind of wanted to start there, because I felt like I don't mean to kind of put up definitions around work or what is and what is not graphic design, but I always thought your work had a certain graphic design leaning to it,
Yeah.
if you know what I mean. And so when I was, preparing for this and I saw that in this one profile that I read, suddenly all of this kind of connected for me. And I was like, okay, this starts to make sense. And so I know we won't stay in this time of your life forever. It sounds like you were aware that you were interested in both the visual and the verbal or the language from a early age, and even when you were studying English, you were taking art classes, and that when you were applying for MFA programs, you were aware of this connection. How how did you see that connection then, and how do you see it now? Because you're still somebody that's making visual work and written work. How do those start to kind of talk to each other, or when did you realize that that could actually be kind of one activity or an activity that is connected in some way?
I think I probably pretty early on at least could sense that they had something in common, whereas like now I barely make the distinction. Like I
Right.
think that probably if someone were to like map out what's happening in my brain when like I'm writing a chapter of this book versus like making a collage or something, I think it's probably something very similar.
Yeah.
Because they're both just processes of like actually, so I remember I had a really key experience in high school, which was I took an English class, and it was yeah, my senior year, and I had a really amazing teacher, and she was basically teaching us like how to trace, like find and trace a theme through a book, like through a novel.
Mm.
And so you had to identify some pattern, right? And then you had to kind of like go read through it like looking for that. And I remember I did maybe we all wrote about an invisible man, but anyway, I wrote this essay about an invisible man where I had noticed that in all of these kind of key moments in the narrative, like when he's like disappointed by something, he ends up going down some stairs or going down elevator. Like there's always this like image of
Oh,
like going
interesting. Yeah.
down somewhere. And I really loved writing that paper. Like I still remember it, and I think about it a lot now because I still do that. You know, like when I am
Right.
researching
Right.
something, I'm just, and it's not just books, right? It's like every conversation I have, every movie I see, like just anything that I happen to come across, like events that I go to, it's all kind of like almost involuntarily like passing through this filter all the time.
Hmm.
And it's just like, what is the shape of the filter is the only thing that really changes.
Yeah.
And that includes visual material. So I think, you know, when I'm scrolling across Google Earth looking for something, it's the same exact thing. Like you're just looking for something that you already have some idea of, and then you're just collecting this big pile of those things. And then the question is just like, how can I order these in a way that makes either a new argument or reanimates
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
original fascination with them?
That's so. When did you realize? I love that. By the way, it reminds me of I interviewed the designer Michael Rock, who's a principal at the design studio 2x4, and he originally studied English literature and poetry in undergrad, I think, and then went on to be a graphic designer. And he had this great quote when I talked to him that he sees graphic design as a elaborate form of writing, in that it is this way. It's taking these pre-existing things, words, punctuation, sentences, and kind of collaging them together in new ways. And design is doing that also. It's taking images and typefaces, and I think that's it's actually like a great definition of your work also, because you're kind of taking these things uh, and putting them together in new ways.
Yeah.
You have a quote. I can't remember if it was in the book or if it was in an interview where uh, the one work you did for the dump, where you kind of collected all this stuff, and someone said, "Did you make anything?" And I feel like that's like very emblematic of this whole idea of what design is. Actually, I didn't make that connection until you were just saying that.
Yeah, right. That woman was, yeah, she asked me, did you actually make anything or did you just put things on shelves?
Right.
And I was like, wow, like put things on shelves is such a great description of what I do. Like
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
just like constantly like collecting things and putting them on shelves, like either like literally or metaphorically.
Right.
And yeah.
I mean, this is actually a an interesting way to connect to the book, because I have two questions that I want to start with about the book. And I really enjoyed it, and it was not at all what I was expecting it to be. And if you asked me what I was expecting it to be, I couldn't tell you. I've been thinking about this all morning to prepare for this. And my first question is, over the process of reading the book, I started talking to a bunch of people about it and things that I was thinking about related to what you were writing about. And I had the hardest time describing what this book was about. And I don't mean, I mean that as a compliment. Every time I think I know what it's about, you would take a turn and it would be about something else. How do you describe this book?
I honestly have like as much of a hard time as the next person.
Okay.
And which is, a problem because I get asked that a lot,
Yeah.
Even like, when I was working on it last summer, it's like, because I spent all my time working on it, it's like, obviously my friends would want to know what it was about. And
Yeah.
like, it's like, as soon as I say the title, it's like, I have to qualify it because I'm like, oh no, it's not like this, like how to be creative or, like how to have a nice like vacation or something.
Right.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I guess I think like one of the phrases that I find like comes up a lot when I do try to describe it is like this idea of like attending to what is in front of you, which is like kind of the most obvious part of my argument, where it's like just as like reminder it's like it goes back to putting things on shelves, right? It's like it's just me reminding you or like providing some framework for you to just have access to the thing that's already in front of you, that's been there all along. I mean, as like I feel like I have a bird watching metaphor for everything, as you can imagine, because there's a lot of bird watching in the book. But when I go bird watching, I always actually forget to look right in front of me. And so I have my binoculars and I'm like looking around, in the trees or far away, or like, because I'm thinking about like how I'm going to have to, spot this very small thing that's going to be far away. And I several times have like walked right up to like some really special or like rare bird that was right in front of my face. And then it like flies away because I just like barged up to, yeah. And so I'm like, wow, that's like such a, it's like this weird example of like forgetting, like if you're always looking over there, like I'm always looking like, worrying, like looking into the future or whatever. And it's like, you're forgetting that there's something really important that's like right in front of your face.
And I agree with that. I think that's actually a really good way to describe what it's about. But I also want to ask you about this idea you mentioned early on in the book about how this term self-care has kind of lost some of its meaning. That wasn't your exact phrasing, but that there's kind of more to it than the way we kind of think about it now. And I think the way you just described the book, it would be very easy for someone to think that this is like a self-help book. This is just a book about being present or mindful.
Right.
And even that is kind of overly simplified. And so the reason I asked you what it was about is because I was curious about your process of writing it. And I feel like with a different editor, that book could have became one of those self-help books about looking in front of you. And I get the sense that it was important to you that it was not like that it did have a little bit more poetics to it and a little bit more thoughtfulness in how you talk about this.
Yeah, I think maybe like one thing that's helps explain the weirdness of that is like, so I think Malcolm Harris's blurb on the book cover, I'm looking at it right now. He says like, oh yeah, it's a self-help for the collectively minded.
Right.
And one of the things that I'm like really pushing against in the book is the cult of individuality, and even like what you think is yourself. And so like I'm kind of trying to imagine what the opposite of a personal brand is. Like if you were to follow all of your algorithmically recommended things, then you would sort of, in my thought experiment, like you would just become kind of like static and stable set of preferences that's really easy to advertise to. And that's also like a very, I think, like a lonely existence because you're never really like encountering anything outside of yourself. And so I think it's the self-help thing, like it both is and it isn't, because if you let go of the sort of like stable, bounded ego like model of the individual, and you recognize this sort of more like ecological model of the self, then like the term self-help doesn't mean the same thing anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So I think that's what self-help for the collectively minded like means. And I totally agree with that characterization.
What I liked about the book is that this was a book that I think also could have very easily been a book that was kind of against technology, against social media, and it isn't that. Um, and it's like you said, like the thing I took from it is that there are these networks that exist right in front of us, and that we sometimes spend so much time trying to connect with people online, uh, but we can also just kind of connect with our neighbors, and that shouldn't sound radical, but somehow it kind of does.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
totally. No, it's really, I mean, it's something I still think about. I went to this event a couple nights ago that was part of something called Labor Fest, which is like
Mm,
a month long series of events around labor stuff, and it was originally started to commemorate the general strike, which I write about in the book.
right.
And of course, I found out about it from a pamphlet at KPFA, which is like our local radio station in Berkeley. And anyway, so I went to that event, and it was like in a union hall and I had never been in there before. I didn't even know where it was. And it was just, I don't know, I kept thinking afterwards about like why, because before, when I found out about it, I wanted to go because it was about the gig economy. Like they were having
Mm,
3 speakers talk about like organizing Uber and Lyft drivers and like IT workers, and like making this direct connection to like the era of the general strike. And that's something that I'm interested in for my own sort of research purposes. But I was like, well, maybe, do I have to go to this event, or can I just read about it? Or can I just like read about these things, or like
mm.
read the book that this guy wrote or whatever? And kind of at the last minute, I was like, no, I should just go. I need to go to this event. So I went there, and it was just, it's like the diversity of the crowd made me really embarrassed about kind of the rest of my life. Like
Mm.
I was just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like it, and diverse in every way, like all, backgrounds and ages. And it was like people, like having an actual conversation about trying to do something, like about actual
Right.
legislation. And it like, everyone was concerned, but there wasn't like, no one was like freaking out. Like it was just like, no, we're just going to have this conversation about this. And it was like 2 hours long. And I left, and I remember like I looked at my phone, and I happened to open Twitter, and um the top of Twitter moments was like, the headline was like, fans defend Jason Momoa's like dad bod photos or something like that. Like it was so
Yeah,
surreal. Like I was like, oh
yeah,
my
yeah,
God. Like, I just left this
yeah.
room with like, and the room is like, I can't describe, like the room could not be any more different from Twitter. Like it was an old building, it had these kind of like, just like a bunch of chairs, it was like very, I don't know, it was just like a normal space, if that makes sense. So it's
Mhm.
just like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
normal people. And I was just like, wow, this is such a huge disconnect. And it made me like, it made me feel very, I don't know, like my experience of the world was just like so narrow. And yet, like,
Yeah.
if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, you start to think like everything exists there, and you think you're getting a variety of contexts
R-
and information. I was like, wow, no, I'm really not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm curious. I 100% know exactly what you're talking about. I've definitely been in situations where I felt that same way, like the like blinders that are blocking your peripheral vision have suddenly
Mhm.
been taken off.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how do you think about these ideas, both what you just said, but also these larger ideas that you talk about in the book, within, how do they relate to your own artwork, I guess?
Yeah.
And also as a teacher, how does this relate to things that you're thinking about in the classroom and talking to your students about? And are those even related?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, I say that I was embarrassed by that moment, but I also found it very exhilarating because it means that there's,
Right,
like
of course.
something that this whole, world that I don't know about. And there's like so much that I could learn, very quickly. Like the learning curve would be
Mhm,
really steep for me.
mhm,
And so I think that I just personally like seek out that feeling. And then
mhm,
I think that's what motivates a lot of my artwork and is also what I'm trying to create for the viewer. So, when I put things on shelves, um, when I was
right.
an artist in residence at the dump, like that was about, like I just spent 3 months monomaniacally researching the manufacturing origins and like all of the information about these 200 objects that were thrown away. And now
Mhm,
I want you to have the same experience that I had,
mhm,
and so they were on shelves and they had, little tags that people could scan and get all of that information. So you could stand in front of an object and look at street view of the factory or watch the commercial on YouTube. And I was really pleased that some people, once they kind of figured out what the whole conceit was, they not only went down the line, they were scanning every single object. Then they
mhm.
ran out of time, so they came back the next day,
Oh, nice.
to finish, reading about
That's
them.
great.
And like that, I think that was like one of my most, I mean, I felt like actually successful in that moment in what I was trying to do.
Mhm,
And so I try to collect examples of, given that both of my classes are about basically digital art or design.
okay. Yeah, that was my
Um,
next question, is what kind of students are you
so I,
teaching, and what kind of classes?
yeah, they're typically non-art majors. Once in a while, I'll get an art major, but they also tend to be from outside of the humanities.
Mm,
And so I try to give them a lot of examples of technologically mediated experiences or works that ultimately work to kind of like give you more access to something that's already there, like the physical world.
oh,
Um,
I see.
and like as many examples as they can give them of that, versus like something that is sort of like digital, like a digital dead end kind of,
Right, right.
like 3D scanning for the sake of 3D scanning or something like that.
Mhm, mhm.
And I think like probably one of my favorite moments as a teacher, this is my end of my 5th year. Just
Okay.
happened last quarter where I had a student check out a microscope camera from we have a bunch of like fancy things you can check out in the art department. Um, and so it's a microscope, but you can sort of like detach this thing and
Oh,
move it around and look at weird
interesting.
stuff. And so he made this like weird, it looks like an abstract film kind of, and it's set to this like classical piece from Fantasia.
Nice.
And like it was really beautiful. And then afterwards, no one knew it. He hadn't said anything about the microscope camera yet. And then so
Okay.
we watched it. We're like, wow, it's beautiful. What was that? And he was like, oh, that was my hair. And he had been moving the camera around in his hair, like
Oh, wow.
to this music, which is that's amazing in and of itself. But then afterwards, someone was like, "Oh, what's that folder on your computer?" And he's like, "Oh, that's just like some random like fun images I made with the camera like when I got it." And so he
Uh-huh.
started going through them, and he's like, "Here's some paprika, and like here's the
Mm,
carpet." And every time he would like spacebar preview one of these images, like the entire room, and this is a bunch of like 20, 21 year olds would like gasp with delight.
yeah. Yeah.
um, and then someone was like, "Oh, did you do your skin?" And he was like, "Yeah, but like I'm not going to show that. That's gross." And they all just started chanting "skin." Like they were like "skin, skin, skin," and then he like opened it. Everyone was like, "Ah,"
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it was so like I don't know, it was amazing. But it's a really good example of right, like of like that's a very it's a piece for a
yeah.
digital art class. It's using digital tools, but it is ultimately about like some weird like granular details of something that's seemingly banal and everyday. And like that's what I'm like really trying to get across in that class.
I guess we should go back a little bit. So how did you start teaching? Was that something you were always interested
Um,
in doing?
I was, but I didn't actually. I I didn't think that I was going to be able to, or maybe I just like wasn't expecting to at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I had been working at Gap corporate for 3 years,
Yeah.
and just kind of marking time there. And then, yeah, like, I guess just the circumstances of it were very accidental. Um, SFAI, I think most schools have to do this where they have like an outside kind of like panel of, usually like professors from other schools will come and
Mhm.
kind of like appraise different departments. So they'll have students from that department come in, like past and present, and they'll present
Okay.
their work. And then these two outside people, two or three, will provide some sort of feedback or make an assessment or something like that. And so I met the person who hired me when I went back to SFAI for their kind of design and technology
Mm.
evaluation or
Okay.
whatever. Um, and I don't know, maybe I would have met her eventually anyway, but it was very fortuitous. And I gave a talk in her class, which is now the class I'm teaching. And yeah, I just tried to do a really good job. And then, something opened up. So
Yeah.
but yeah, but
That's
it
awesome.
was just like a lot of like really, yeah, good timing, right time, right place.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason I ask is because I'm curious about the experience of teaching, and even the story you told about the microscope camera. I think is very connected to the book and the ideas of the book. And I'm the thing that I'm wondering about is how the experience of teaching influenced how you think about these ideas. Because for me, as a new teacher, I've been teaching for 4 years, so about the same time. Each year for me, each time I start a new class, it's back to trying to notice things again. It's kind of really seeing, okay, who's in this room right now, and how do I respond to them. It's very much about the ideas of the book, I think, in a sort of closed environment. Is that similar to you?
Yeah, I think so. I dedicated the book to my students
Yeah.
because I kind of feel like I wrote it for them, like out of
Mhm.
almost a sense of like maternal concern, because I
Yeah.
had just like observed the kind of the pitch of like stress and anxiety going up over the time that I've been there. And I think I see it especially because I'm teaching an art class again to students not in the humanities. And I was finding that it would sometimes take a lot of coaxing and encouragement to basically tell someone who thinks that they've gotten to where they are by jumping through all the hoops in exactly the right way, that they need to
Right.
do something where there isn't a right answer and there's no optimal way to do it. There
Right.
might not even be examples of someone having done that before, and me trying, like I'm in the background being like, it should be fun, it's like,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
really hard. And so and then I was also noticing that, because I don't know what the rest of their schedules look like, but it sometimes seemed like this class was like a place where they could express some of the feelings that they
Mhm.
were having. I remember like one year, one of my classes, they have to choose a theme to make all of their work about, and someone's theme was just averageness. And
Oh.
when she said the word averageness, I felt like everyone in the room like sighed. you know?
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
I think I've been thinking about it through
Huh.
just like seeing what they're thinking about and what they get subjected to and what they're expected to do, which is just, unreasonable. And I don't think that's
Yeah.
specific to that school, but yeah. So and then I've also just noticed more recently that my class works a lot better when I do something that's closer to do nothing farming, which is what I talk about at the end of the book.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And like, which is, I mean, you already read about it, but it's basically a form of farming that does still produce rice, but it doesn't include flooding the fields. It requires no chemical or mechanical inputs. And it's really just more about being an incredibly observant and attentive steward of a space,
Mm.
and kind of trying to achieve a balance,
Mhm.
but not like it's like the opposite of industrial farming, which is very overdetermined and kind of like
Right.
this will produce this at this time. And so I've noticed that there were a couple quarters where I felt like I wasn't doing enough work, as a
Mm-hmm.
teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I would get worried, and then my students would do something like that microscope thing, and I would be like, "Oh, I
Right.
just need to I need to be available, and I need to give
Right.
them inspiring examples, and I need to make sure that like they're talking to each other and feel supported." But like that's kind of about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you think that came? I don't mean to draw too many connections between, kind of your when we started talking about this about your interest in graphic design today, but the way you talked about that design technology program and feeling kind of lost and that you had no idea what you're supposed to be doing, do you think that had an influence on how you are now thinking about teaching? Because it's kind of similar in a way, you know what I mean? There is a certain openness to it
Yeah.
that I find really interesting.
Yeah, I think so, probably. I mean, one thing that I really wished that I had when I was at SFAI that I don't think I necessarily got was um, like like someone sort of like holding up some kind of support that is almost
Mm-hmm.
like trailing behind you, like like, okay, you like go and do whatever it is and without precedent, right? But like whatever you do, like I am here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Or even something like oh, you're starting to go in this new weird direction that you don't know anything about, like here are some artists that didn't do the same thing, but like maybe this would just be like helpful context for you, or even like just a text to read. Like I found the most helpful parts of my grad program to be the critical theory classes, which
Mm,
everyone else hated
yeah,
because they just wanted to make art.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I took that's where I first encountered Hannah Arendt and
yeah, yeah,
like just really things that I still use to this day. So I think that influences my teaching, where it's like I want to give them that empty open space at the same time that I understand that, especially given where they're coming from, like they need to feel supported and not like you're setting them up to fail.
yeah. This is a very selfish question because this is something I think about as a teacher all the time, and I have a feeling that you're good at what you're talking about kind of being that support system, and it might be different in that I'm teaching in kind of graphic design programs where a lot of students are thinking about wanting to be a graphic designer and what do they need to know to have a good portfolio so they can get jobs as graphic designers. And I'm a teacher similar to you where I kind of want them to experiment and try different things and don't put a lot of parameters around things. And I'm constantly trying to find this balance between basically three things. And I've talked about this with a bunch of people on the podcast, but I think you might have some interesting ideas around this. I'm kind of trying to balance between teaching them the things they need to know to get jobs, creating a place where they can be experimental and feel comfortable and like they have that support system, but then also not creating a bunch of mini me's and just
Mhm.
showing all the stuff that I'm interested in. And somebody like yourself who has a public persona, who has work that is known and has been shown, how do you kind of show the things that you're interested in while also encouraging that experimentation so everyone's not just becoming a new Jenny,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I mean, I actually show very little of my work in class because it's not, I find it increasingly irrelevant to what I'm teaching.
Yeah. Well,
Well, no, I mean, I'll still show it, but it's like, for example, like the class that I basically inherited from the person who hired me, that's kind of like a survey digital art class. And so it's changed a lot now, but I originally got her slides at like her keynote
mm,
presentations. And
oh,
so my
interesting.
work was in the collage section, which is really the only place it belongs, like in terms of like visual
Right.
art. So,
Yeah.
and that's sort of similar in my other class as well. So I think for me, it's like showing them it's almost like my book in a way, right? It's like I'm showing them such a wide range of types of work from different types of people, like, old and new, that there isn't an
Hmm.
obvious, it doesn't converge on any point. And then I try to be I think there's a really, really big difference between being compelled by fear or being pulled by curiosity. And like,
Mm.
it's really hard to move someone from one into the other. And like, like trying to do what you think you're supposed to do to get a good grade is being compelled by fear, in my opinion.
Right.
Versus like, like, I mean, if you even see this, right, like with kids, right, like in elementary school where there's sometimes like they'll just get really into something. And if you have a good teacher, like that teacher will recognize that even if that's not on the curriculum, like that should be encouraged. And so like I try to be really like watch for like moments when I have a student who, gets really into like one of the examples that I showed, and they're like, I want to see more of that, and I have an assignment at the end of the class where they have to give like, it's sort of an artist talk, but they have to choose one of the artists that's been covered in, and there's like so many, because they don't spend a whole lot of time on each one, but they will choose an artist that they feel has influenced or could influence their work. And they have to kind of give a talk, doing further research on that artist, but connecting it to their own ideas and their own work. And it kind of jumpstarts that process of like a lot of them have said things like, oh, I actually like really enjoyed researching this artist, and now I want to know more, or I want to research other artists. So kind of like an artificial way of like kind of encouraging that, like actually, just deeply as a person wanting to know more about something rather than like trying to fulfill some sort of rubric as a student.
I would hate myself if I didn't talk to you about there's no such thing as a free watch. This is not exaggeration when I tell you that this is one of my favorite pieces of writing of the last couple of years. I have assigned this to my design students as a lesson in branding and the kind of artifice of branding. I've assigned it to writing students to kind of talk about the structure and how you go about writing this piece. And so for listeners who don't know what this is about, you kind of look at this phenomenon of these free watches on Instagram, and kind of it's really like an investigating where these come from and what they mean. But then you kind of raise all of these larger questions. How did you get started on this piece and this kind of phenomenon, which again goes back to this kind of earlier thing we were talking about kind of going down these rabbit holes and just kind of digging deeper? That piece is such a good example of that.
That actually has there's a funny story behind how that started, because it technically is an outgrowth of my residency at the dump. I was at the dump, and my project was called the Bureau of Suspended Objects, which is a one-person bureau that researches discarded objects. And so after I left the dump, I kind of did a couple of different residencies in different places as the bureau, where I would accept pre-trash from people. So that's things that they still own but mean to get rid of. And so I'm sort of doing them a favor. But I make them fill out this really bureaucratic form that I modeled after the W-2.
I love that.
And it's carbon copy, actually. And
that is amazing.
Yeah, it's funny because
how do you even get something printed? How do you even get carbon copy paper printed?
The copy place in Palo Alto like happened to have that option, so it's a little expensive. Awesome. But yeah, so the questions are all like, where did you get this? Why did you get rid of it? What's your guilt level, 1 to 10? And I found that the overwhelming majority of pre-trash is gifts. So that's sort of interesting in and of itself. But and so I had done that, and my two friends of mine were running this thing called the Museum of Capitalism, which was it basically ran all summer. And they got a museum grant to do this project. It was a pretty big installation of artwork, and the conceit of the whole thing was sort of like looking at capitalism as a disaster in the past, sort of like a rhetorical, like a speculative fiction kind of thing.
So good.
Yeah, it was really amazing. And they and actually I also gave the talk How to Do Nothing, the original talk, at that museum.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize.
I did like a practice run of it there before IO. And so I was going to be in residence as the bureau. And the original plan was that they had collected a box of things, artifacts from people. And they had just been asking visitors to donate artifacts of capitalism, which is, however you interpret that. And so they had these boxes of stuff, and I was going to come in and I was going to do the bureau thing, and research these objects. And the very first object that I pulled out was the watch. And I never got past the watch, obviously.
Okay.
They had also given people forms, and this form said like, I got this watch on Instagram, even though I knew it was probably going to be a piece of shit. Like I feel so dumb now, and it's like this like tone of rueful resignation. And yeah, I just started looking into it, and then I realized that it was kind of, I have to say that everything that I was able to find something about at the dump or that someone gave me has something weird in the story. So I was expecting that. I just wasn't expecting the rabbit hole to be that long.
Like I said, I assign this to students to talk about branding and how branding is a storytelling around a object or a company that is often not that it's a lie, but it's made up to suggest something. And I think the free watch phenomenon is that at its purest.
Yeah.
How do you think about it now? Kind of going down that rabbit hole and kind of finding all of this stuff. Do you also see it as something about kind of design and branding and how we kind of live in the world and respond to objects?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about branding and appearances, I think. Like this, I mean, I think my favorite parts of it are when like someone did like a bad Photoshop job of something, where it's like, oh, now anything can be anything. And just, like how, as I mentioned in the piece, like there's actually you can't draw a hard line between what's happening with these watches and regular branding. And so I think like that's what it taught me was, like, oh, like all of branding is a narrative and an image that is attached to a sort of arbitrary object. And I think I was kind of primed for that by being at the dump, because it's like, I'm seeing things. It's almost like I was seeing things on the other side from branding. Like you have branding and that's what moves the object in the first place, like to get it to be bought.
Right.
And then my whole like pre-trash part of the project was showing how like something becomes trash when someone decides that it's trash. And it's a super subjective moment. Right. And then, one of the exhibitions that I did as the Bureau, I had collected these objects from people, and I knew with each one, like why someone had gotten rid of it. In some cases, like hated this object. And then during the exhibition, I let visitors claim one object each with like the red dot that you use in a gallery.
Oh yeah.
And hearing about why people were claiming things, like after having heard why other people were getting rid of them, was a really, really amazing experience, because I could see like these instances in which like two different people are seeing two different things when they look at the same object. And so branding is just like, just an attempt to manipulate that thing that already happens.
I love that. It's so good. I mean, I purposely saved talking about that essay for the end, because I could have talked to you about it for an hour, and it would have just been me telling you how great of an essay it was and how much I love it. Anyway, you just finished this book. It's great. What are you thinking about now? What's next for you? What rabbit hole are you going down now?
I am doing some research around the history of how time became money. Because I think the mentality of time is money is it's something that I talk about in the book, but I'm talking about the downstream effects of it. I'm not actually like talking about the history of how that came to be. And it's, it's been really fascinating just like reading about, I just read a book about the exporting of Western colonial clock time to colonies that had, obviously very different conceptions, indigenous like conceptions of time. The history of something like Taylorism in the factory, like this. This is why I went to that labor thing the other day, is because I'm, trying to think about this longer process that starts, it goes all the way back to even like monasteries and stuff. But I feel like I'm, especially in the Bay Area, like living in this kind of dystopian extreme version of that, like the extreme end of that, with things like, TaskRabbit and pretty much all gig work. So that's my my current rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of a very logical continuation of How to Do Nothing, because so much of that, like you said, is not mentioned in the book is just this kind of cult of productivity, and always having to get things done.
Yeah, and the kind of something I didn't really appreciate until I started doing this research was how much of it is tied to the Protestant work ethic, which is this. Like it's like I was reading this like list of basically elements of the Protestant work ethic, and they sound like something that would be posted in a startup. Where it's like you're supposed to work really hard and amass lots of wealth, but you're not supposed to flaunt it. I was just like, oh, that's the hoodie. Like
Right.
but it's a sort of it's like the religion of work, and
Yeah.
it was really eye-opening for me to see that it has like that explains like why even if you knew you didn't have to work, you would still feel sort of like morally impelled to work, and some people would still feel morally impelled to work really hard.
My last question, this is a question that I use to end all of these conversations. What are some books or authors or writers who have kind of influenced how you think about all of this that we've been talking about, whether that is, kind of influences on the book, how you think about teaching, your own work? Who are the people that you kind of look to, or the books you look to as models of that?
Let's see. That's hard because there's so many.
Or even just people that you're reading right now too. It doesn't have to be like the Jenny Odell canonical
right.
text.
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of Technics and Civilization by Mumford. And I think that that's something that anyone who works in or near technology should read, because it's kind of this like a really it was written in the 30s, I think, but it's this like history of technology that could be very dry, but it just has so many weird moments in it, and just like really strange like things that you would, I don't know, like for example, this is where I learned that like when glass windows became commonplace, that they were so expensive that people would take the windows out and store them away when they left their house.
Okay. I did not know that.
But just like I don't know, like it's just there's another book. What is it called? River of Shadows by Rebecca Solnit.
Oh yeah.
So if you like
I
that book,
love that book.
if you like that book,
Okay.
then I think you would enjoy this. I mean, it's quite hefty. It's a tome. It's been taking me a
I'm
while.
adding it to my list right now.
Yeah. And let's see. I also have been recently turned on to this German philosopher named Byung-Chul Han.
I don't know who that is.
I think he's most well known for the Burnout Society, which I still haven't read. But multiple people who read my book recommended him to me. And then I gave a reading in Point Reyes, and the bookstore owner just gave me a free copy of The Agony of Eros, which is a really short book. It's almost like an essay that he wrote. And it's like I read it. I understand why he gave it to me. I'm like, maybe it's good that I didn't have it before I wrote my book, because I think I have so many sources in my book, so I just like didn't need any more. But he has like such, and he talks about Martin Buber, who I also talk about in my book.
Okay.
But the Agony of Eros is about like basically sort of desire and like eros and like curiosity being increasingly impossible in a situation where you think that everything is accessible and visible to you, and that the more sort of imagined access you have to this mysterious other, like the more you're actually pushing them away, or they're becoming inaccessible to you. And I don't know, it's just such a good description of, I think what I was trying to say in my book is lost when you become this sort of like stable, algorithmically determined personal brand, is that you'll only encounter sort of reflections of yourself everywhere else, and that's kind of a very lonely and depressing place to be.
I don't mean to end this on such a dark, depressing note, but I aside from the depressing ending, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm a big fan of your work. I loved the book. and your work in general. I was really excited for this. I thought this turned out great. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
This episode was recorded on July 12th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.